Whew. Okay, so just to recap for a minute, what we just said about employer discrimination is essentially two things. First of all, we said that the level of labor market discrimination, by which I mean wage differences, right, between white and non-white workers, is going to be determined both by the level of discrimination on the part of employers, level of prejudice on the part of employers, and on the size of the marginalized group. The reason that's going to matter is because the actual wage differences between white and non-white workers, right, in a competitive labor market are going to be set by the marginal employer, right? As a consequence, the most prejudiced, the least prejudiced employers don't really matter. Which employer is marginal depends on the size of the marginalized group. The other thing that we said is that employers essentially have to pay a bigot tax, right? The more prejudiced you are, or if you're prejudiced enough to not hire non-white workers, you're going to pay for that in this form of higher labor costs. The result is going to be that your economic profits are lower than the economic profits of your less prejudiced competitors. And there's this idea that over time, this bigot tax should be a force pushing towards lower levels of wage inequality, right? It should push prejudiced firms out of the market. It should pull less prejudiced firms into the market. Okay, so what we're going to do now, in a little bit less detail, right, a little less length, is to think through prejudice originating from two other important actors in labor markets. So first we're going to think about customers, then we're going to think about other employees. So customer prejudice is going to operate very similar to employer prejudice, with the only real difference being that we don't have this idea that customers should be forced out of the market by this force towards economic profits being zero. So first of all, what I mean by customer prejudice, probably should have started there, is we might think that in certain markets, customers themselves have a preference for interacting with one type of employees over another, right? We might think that in a restaurant, prejudiced customers are going to prefer working or being served by white servers than being served by non-white servers. So if that's the case, we can think about there being a distribution of customer prejudice, right? If we think again about our firms ranging from 1 to 100, we can think about firm 1 as having the least prejudiced customers, firm 100 having the most prejudiced customers. And we can again think about sub-level D, which in this case is going to be the willingness of a customer in dollars to pay to avoid interacting with non-white workers. So one story here is that maybe customer prejudice is fairly rare, right? We're not going to have that many bigoted or discriminatory customers. In that case, we might have a distribution of D, something like this, right? Where the most prejudiced firms have customers who are willing to pay a lot in order to avoid interacting with non-white workers, but most firms have customers who really don't care, either because their customers have more progressive values or because they're involved in some sort of a business where customers and employees don't really interact all that much, right? When we think that we're more likely to encounter customer prejudice at a restaurant than we are to encounter customer prejudice at a warehousing and distributions company, right? So in this case, we're going to have exactly the same story about how prejudice is going to lead to labor market discrimination. If the marginal firm is something like this, right, so a firm that isn't prejudiced at all, then we're going to get a wage gap of 0, right? We're going to have this customer prejudice resulting in no difference whatsoever between the wages of white workers and the wages of non-white workers. What customer prejudice is going to mean is that for all of these firms with prejudiced customers, they're going to find it in their interests to only hire white workers because they suffer a cost in terms of dissatisfied customers from having non-white workers on staff. White workers and non-white workers earn identical wages, right? So these firms are going to hire only white. These firms are going to be racially integrated. Why racially integrated? Because since there's no difference at all between the wages of white and non-white workers, because these firms don't care whether their employees are white or non-white, right? There's no reason whatsoever for the remaining white workers, right? Remember, this group here is white workers. And the non-white workers, there's no reason at all for them to work in different firms, right? So the simple story here is going to be, in situations where only a few firms have prejudiced customers, the only consequence of customer prejudice is going to be to create fully segregated workplaces in the most prejudiced places, right? So we think there's a handful of country clubs or something where customers are willing to pay to avoid interacting with non-white workers. Those places are going to be entirely segregated. Add either more widespread customer prejudice or a very, very large number of non-white or marginalized workers, right? So what if we had a distribution of customer prejudice more like this, right? Where again, we're going to max out at around 10. And we've got, let's say, 2/3 of employers have customers who have a preference for white workers, and we have a marginal employer like this. Well, in this case, we're going to have exactly the same story that we had with employer level discrimination, right? All of these firms are going to hire only non-white workers. All of these are going to hire only white workers. And D star is going to equal the wage gap. The only difference between this story and the employer level discrimination story is that in this case, employers themselves are not the ones suffering a loss in profits, right? Essentially, employers are going to take this cost here and pass it on to your customers. So if you're a restaurant that serves bigoted clients, right, who don't want to interact with non-white servers, your prices are going to have to be higher to account for the fact that your labor costs are higher. There's still going to be a bigot tax in this model, but the bigot tax is going to be paid by customers rather than being paid by employers. And unfortunately, right, we don't think that competitive market prices drive bigoted customers out of the market. Okay.